Eboo, so it's great to spend some time with you, fellow traveler in so many different ways. I'm excited and glad to actually kind of dive deep into some issues that, just happen to be at the top of everybody's screen, feed, newspaper, and mind. Let's actually kind of take a step back. We've been in this work. You've been leading Interfaith for 20 years now, and which is just amazing. And congratulations. I'm curious, kind of like what inspired you to get started on this? And then what inspires you to keep the work going every day?
Thank you for that question. And Raj, I'm grateful for our friendship. You're somebody I admired from afar before we became friends, and I still admire even in a friendship. So it's always wonderful to work with and engage with folks that are warm and funny and friendly and that you admire. So thank you for being that kind of person. There are deep things, as Alistair McIntyre might say, there are stories that I belong to in which pluralism is a central feature. I belong to the story of the Ismaili interpretation of Islam. And in Islam in general, the idea of people from, as the Quran says, different nations and tribes getting to know one another is a central feature. And in the Ismaili interpretation of Islam, this small Shia community that I belong to, it's even more salient because our spiritual leader, the Aga Khan, speaks about pluralism so frequently, right? So that is a story that I belong to, and I feel a responsibility for helping live out the next chapter of that. I belong to the story of America, and we are the world's first attempt at diverse democracy, and the dimension of diversity that the founders of the 1776 generation paid the most attention to was religious diversity, and the one that they came the closest to getting right. And so I feel like I am part of the next chapter of what does America as a religiously diverse democracy look like. I'm also a social entrepreneur. And so, since high school, I just started things, and it occurred to me in the mid-1990s, there wasn't enough attention paid to the connection between faith, diversity, and social change. And so, like I started other things, I started this, and then it just kept going and going and growing and growing. So here I am. What keeps me going? I mean, part of it is I love the long arc. Part of it is the world needs the work of cooperation across difference. And part of it is I also love the day-to-day. Like Gwendolyn Brooks says, live not for the end of the song, live in the along. Like, I love the day-to-day.
Awesome. So let's dive even a little bit more into pluralism. In Sacred Ground, book that you wrote, you said, quote, pluralism is not a birthright in America, it's a responsibility. Pluralism does not fall from the sky, it does not rise up from the ground. People have fought for pluralism. People have kept the promise. America is exceptional not because there is magic in our air, because there is fierce determination in our citizens. So in that fierce determination, where does pluralism play a part? I mean, you allude to it with the founders, but talk about this a little bit more.
Yeah, so that's a good paragraph. I'm proud that I wrote that. So look, I was just at the University of Illinois at Chicago this morning. I met with the chancellor there, and on that campus is the Jane Addams Hull House Museum in the building where she first built Hull House. So here's this woman, mid-late 20s, in Chicago in the late 19th century, 1880s, in a city that Max Weber once said, being in Chicago is like seeing a man with his skin peeled off. Okay, like that's how like raw the city was. And she is seeing these immigrants pour in from Southern and Eastern Europe. And she's seeing all these quote unquote natives in Chicago and elsewhere be brutally excluding to these immigrants. And she says, I'm going to build a place where not only do you feel welcome, but you can cooperate together and you can be contributors. And she builds that place over a half century, Hull House. And the ethic that is established at Hull House becomes an entire layer of American democracy that we basically take for granted. So that's fierce determination. And one of the things that distinguishes Jane Addams is Jane Addams wasn't somebody who went around principally telling other people what they were doing wrong. Jane Addams wasn't part of the resistance. Jane Addams was a builder. Jane Addams created something better. She wasn't principally an arsonist against the old system. She was principally an architect of the new system. And so I think about all the people like Jane Addams, right? All the people who build places where people from different identities and divergent ideologies can cooperate together. That's who I want to be.
We deal a lot in higher education college campuses. You just alluded to being on one this morning. How should and how has higher ed done in building architects instead of arsonists?
So I think the long trajectory of higher ed on this is good. And I think that most of the architects of our civil society come out of higher ed, right? Mm-hmm. And many of them would say that their formative experience in connecting with people who are different from them and then learning the vision, knowledge base, the skill set of creating things is from their college or grad school experience. I think that's super important. I do think that a social change paradigm has basically embedded itself in higher ed over the past few years, which privileges the fist in the air over the extended hand. It privileges the tear things down instead of build things up. It privileges critique over creation. And look, I think that a controlled burn is sometimes important for positive change, but a social change ecosystem cannot have 100 arsonists for every architect.
What would be the core elements to building architects? Or tell me where you've seen those core elements.
So you mean, how would a college campus create those folks? I mean, so one of the couple things that we tell campuses they should do. Number one is use a case study approach to the development of leaders in the same way a medical school would or a business school would. Like, here is an actual situation. There is a knockdown, drag-out fight over Drag Queen Story Hour in the library in Lake Luzerne, New York. You are called in to create cooperation in this community. And the stakes are stark, right? Like, the library is now closed. The library in Lake Luzerne, New York is closed because the staff was so traumatized by this fight that they couldn't come back to work. In fact, some were hospitalized and nobody else applied for those jobs. You were called in to nurture cooperation. What would you do? Right? So I think this kind of case study approach, which is like, you are a leader in this situation. You can't say to the police, hey, you did a terrible job. You can't only say that. You're the one responsible for public safety. What does that look like? Yeah. Right? So a case study approach, which puts students in the driver's seat as far as being leaders goes, I think is important. The second thing I think is important is to study the history of change makers who were architects, to study the Jane Addamses of the world, right? And the Paul Farmers of the world, and the Wendy Kopps of the world, and the Bill Draytons of the world. How did those people build things? How did those people build things? How did the Mayo Clinic come to be, right? I think that those are hugely important stories, hugely important people to study. We think about social change very often as a fist in the air and getting rid of bad stuff. But really, social change is building better stuff.
Love the idea of stories, and you do stories about as well as anyone I know. I mean, I guess it's part of the preacher, the minister in you. There's one that I recently heard you say that, at least to me, had tremendous salience. Talk to me about football versus baseball.
Yeah. So I think there are different kinds of diversity work, right? And there's a kind of diversity work that is principally about telling other people what they're doing wrong. It's principally about critique. It's principally about raising, encouraging people to be dissatisfied with the current situation. I think that there's value to that. There's a kind of social change work which points fingers at people doing wrong. I think that there can be value to that, right? There's a type of social change work which is always about analyzing power dynamics, okay? I call that package of things football. And football has a season and it has a stadium, right? It has its own rules, it has its own equipment, it has its own practices, okay? I call the kind of diversity work that privileges building relationships across difference, that privileges the extended palm over the raised fist, that asks people to ask questions and tell stories that are characterized by curiosity. Mm-hmm. I call that baseball. And I basically said to a college campus, in fact, I said it this morning, your athletic department should have both a baseball team and a football team. And right now we're heading into baseball season. Right now in American life, it's the time for pluralism, right? And here's the thing, you can't hand a baseball to football players. They don't know what to do with it. It's the very rare Bo Jackson of the world, because if you are accustomed to shaping your hand into a fist against people, you haven't built the muscle of extending it into an open palm towards people, right? You're not bad. You're just a football player, and it's baseball season. And by the way, we're not going to let you tackle the baseball players.
The fundamental precept there is the one that you just mentioned, which is it is now baseball season. Tell me what gives you kind of a sense of certainty, or as close to certainty as you can get, that we're now in baseball season and not in football season.
So many institutions in American life that we just expect to work are melting down over disagreements. So, we pull headlines from the New York Times and the Washington Post on this. School board meeting in Burbank, California ends in a screaming match because people can't agree on what's supposed to be on the required reading list. A high school play is canceled in Ithaca, New York, because people can't agree on which identities can be cast into what roles. City council in Teaneck, New Jersey is unable to approve new business licenses because there's such fractiousness between Muslims and Jews over the war in the Middle East. So imagine if your house was on fire and you called the fire department and they were like, hey, who'd you vote for?
Mm-hmm.
And we'll come if we like the answer. Imagine if you had a heart surgery and, you walked into the hospital and they were like, hey, who'd you vote for?
Yeah.
And we'll operate on you if we like the answer. There are societies like that, right? Like the cooperation that we enjoy in American life should not be taken for granted. It should be cherished. It should be protected. It should be strengthened.
One last question before I go to a quick rapid fire round to close this out. You fairly recently started a new series of podcasts where you've been interviewing folks. I'm very curious, who's been the most kind of mind-blowing, eye-popping interview that you've done?
That's a great question. To hear, so I think Trabian Shorter's and what he has to say about race being constructed as an asset and not a deficit, I think is striking and super important. His line, you can't lift people up by putting them down, is really powerful. But because Trabian and I are friends, he's on my board, I read his material, I'd heard some of that before. So I think that's a great podcast to listen to if you're interested in, an under-emphasized paradigm when it comes to diversity as it relates to race. But probably the most eye-popping interview for me was the one I did with John Powell, when he told me his story of becoming a bridge builder and how his dad basically stopped speaking to him when John started to not believe in his particular Christian doctrine, and how that experience ultimately makes John a bridge builder, which I think for 9 out of 10 human beings, the experience of being pushed away by your dad in your family home as a child would make you the opposite of a bridge builder. But for John, it made him a bridge builder.
Amazing person. Amazing. So just a quick rapid fire round to close out this conversation. And I'm going to basically feature it around what we call the big 3 parts of being a well-informed, productively engaged, and committed citizen in this country. And so I'm just going to ask you 3 quick questions. Tell me the first thing that comes to mind for you. The first is just, what makes you optimistic about our democracy?
I'm dispositionally optimistic. I will say that.
Yes.
I am dispositionally optimistic. So I seek out the stories that give me hope.
What makes you, or how do you actively engage in the local community? And can you tell me about a meaningful experience of active engagement?
So, both my boys have played sports. My younger guy currently plays sports. And I'm just like, if I'm not on a basketball court or on a baseball diamond, I'm probably heading towards one. And that's the community of people that if somebody's spouse dies, comes together around that person, right? So it's actually an excellent example of how civil society works, right? Like, in order for you to do something positive for your kid, you have to be part of a team. If you want to be the kid is part of a team. If you want to be part of a team, you have to be part of a community that supports that team. If you have a community that supports that team, then that community supports other things. Yeah. It's actually like an excellent kind of description of how civil society actually works.
Really interesting you should say that. You and I have shared these stories, right?
Yeah.
Do you say
daughter volleyball? Yep.
Yeah. And, I think for most of the parents that I'm with, I don't even know what their job is, like what what's their vocation. I know that they have vocationally in multiple ways, but it's a great point.
But you do anything for their kid, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I actually think that is the ethic that I think we cannot lose in American life, right? Do you know who the people voted for? Nope. Right? And you might really disagree with who they voted for, but are you going to let it destroy the volleyball team?
Yeah. My relationship with those parents now over multiple years, it's not, right? Because I know them three-dimensionally. So It's just pretty powerful. Right. Last question. How do you continue to grow your own civic knowledge base?
I mean, I wake up in the morning at like 5:30, and I just read 12 newsletters or 8 newsletters. And you're probably this, but I'm like, and I'm, constant, and I travel a lot to give talks, but you give talks, you listen a lot too. You listen in Q&As, you listen at dinners, you pay attention to things, right? So I'm a sponge for American civic life and intellectual life and arts life.
Eboo, social entrepreneur, leader, friend, thank you very much. It's been a joy.
Friend, that's the most important category. Friend. I appreciate you, Raj. Thanks for being who you are.
Same here.
Bye.
Thanks.